Hinesville Chapter 14. Vivian made it to her house in Richmond Hill and talked Lane into coming in to have a beer. She grabbed 2 beers and headed to the living room. She handed one to Lane and fell into the couch. "You're still going to Dr. Hardy?" Lane inquired after he took a sip. 3 days a week. She mentioned without really thinking about it and took a sip of her beer. "Viv, it's going to be hard for a while, you know that, right?" She nodded as she looked over at him and then looked down. "I know, just wish it'd hurry up." Lane knew he needed to ask her what she was talking about in South Carolina. "You had said earlier that some weird stuff was going on. What were you talking about?" Vivian thought about all that had happened and tried to organize her thoughts. "I can't speak for Cooper, but I've noticed people following me, and I'll come home and find things moved around outside." Vivian shook her head and looked up at Lane. "One time I got in my truck and I'm telling you I could smell a guy's cologne. And no one had been in my personal truck in weeks. But I haven't noticed anything inside my house so far." Lane nodded and thought. Some of that had been his guys, but some of it hadn't. He began to wonder if he shouldn't put a detail on her, but he knew she would notice quickly. "I have no doubt this has happened, but do you think we need to let Ben and Nate know?" "I talked to Nate about it and Mason has seen some of the vehicles that have followed." Vivian remembered that day and them making snakes all through town. Lane recalled talking to Nate about what she had noticed but made a mental note to talk to Mason about it. "I'm thinking about calling Alex. You remember Alex, right?" Lane nodded. "You know, it might not be a bad idea." Vivian nodded and considered what had happened yesterday at work. "Lane, I feel like I need to tell you this, if not simply because of what Sullivan said at work. I don't want to date Cooper. I really don't want to date anyone but Cooper in particular. I mean, you remember what happened with Paxton." Lane took a sip of his beer and shook his head. "How could I forget that? The whole department knew. I don't need that bullshit again." Vivian took a sip of her beer. "I've kept up with Alex if you need his number," Lane offered. Vivian chuckled nervously. "I say this at the risk of sounding absolutely crazy." This made Lane chuckle. "I've called him a few times with the full intention of talking to him, but when he answered I just couldn't talk." She shrugged. "I don't know why, but I just couldn't bring myself to say anything." "When did you call?" "A couple of times since this summer and more since Jake." Vivian thought for a little while and shook her head. "I'm sure Alex gets it," Lane shrugged. "You just need to talk," Lane chuckled out. Vivian smiled. "I know. Maybe I could call him this week and we could meet up for supper or something. I bet he would like that." The 2 old partners talked for a long while before Lane had to go. Vivian dove head first into unpacking and had it finished by the early afternoon. She cleaned up and then turned on the TV, not really watching it. She was thinking too much to pay attention to the TV. She looked at her phone sitting on the coffee table and thought about calling Alex, and then decided not to. Then she thought about it again and decided to do it. She picked up the phone and located him in her contacts. She tapped the screen, dialing his number. "Hello." She heard Alex at the other end. "Hello." She still couldn't bring herself to say anything. He was Jake's closest friend. She moved her finger to hang up. "Wait. Viv, is that you?" "Don't hang up." He listened and didn't hear that distinctive boop boop asterisk after she hung up. "Come on, Viv. I still miss him too." She could feel the tears running down her face. "I'm sorry, Alex." He breathed a sigh of relief. She actually spoke. "It's nothing. You doing better?" She wiped her face with her hand. "Yes and no. You want me to come over?" Alex offered, hoping she would take him up on it. Vivian thought for a moment. "You want to grab a bite somewhere?" "I'd like that." The 2 made arrangements to meet at a restaurant in Hinesville. Vivian drove her truck over but sat in the parking lot for a short while. She wondered if she shouldn't text Alex and cancel. She put it in park and killed the engine. Then her door opened. She turned to see Alex standing there. "Come here." Alex held his arms open and she stepped out and gave him a hug. "I'm sorry, Alex." Vivian cried, but her voice was solid. "No worries, Viv. I know." Alex held her for a long while until she pulled away. "I check on you all the time." Vivian wiped her face and turned to get her keys and her purse. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Alex chuckled. "I know." Alex remembered watching her truck pass on the rare occasion. "Let's go inside." The 2 of them walked in and found a quiet booth in the back. "You've been all right?" Vivian asked him after they ordered their drinks. Alex nodded. "I can't complain, I've been doing well." He looked up at her and debated if he should mention last summer or not. "Viv, I didn't want to bother you while you were recovering, but how are you?" He watched as she looked up at him. "I know what happened." I'm guessing just about everyone I know does. Vivian sighed and rubbed her temples. The waitress returned with their drinks and they made their order. So, how are you doing? Alex threw his arm across the back of the booth, much in the same style Jake did when he demanded an answer. This made her smile a little to herself. I can honestly say I'm doing better. I see Dr. Hardy a few times a week still. Alex nodded, but he knew there was more on her mind. Have all of the guys seen it? Her request was a little reserved. She guessed she knew the answer but was still hoping it wasn't true. He knew what guys she was talking about, the ones that worked with him and Jake. Alex sat thoughtfully for a short moment. Yeah, as far as I know they all have. Alex watched as she tensed. Honestly, Viv, most people at that federal level had seen it within a month of the incident. Vivian nodded and played with her drink. I figured as much. Don't you know some guys in the FBI? Alex questioned and Vivian nodded. Yeah, I know Ben Hernandez and Nate Garcia really well. They're part of Poker Night. But I know most of the men and women in Statesboro. Just to let you know, most of them have probably seen it by now. I know Ben and Nate have, they told me. Vivian thought about that night not long ago. I was in the house when the guys on the poker crew watched it, so Ben, Nate, Mason, and Lane have seen it. You watched it? Alex questioned, a little surprised. No, Vivian stated in a way that left no room for doubt. I was just in the house. She looked over at Alex. Why did they do that? I mean, all these years, was I just postponing the inevitable? Alex shrugged. I don't know, Viv. I wish I did. Their food soon arrived and they turned to lighter topics while they ate. They both finished but still sat, both of them wanted to talk more. Okay, Viv, you're thinking so hard I can smell the gears getting hot. Vivian chuckled and nodded. There's a couple of things. Why did they release a copy of the video? I mean, why go to all that trouble, doing something that everyone is telling me they shouldn't have done to begin with, and then release it for everyone? Vivian rolled her eyes. To see. She looked confused as she considered what had transpired over the last several months. I can't imagine they wanted everyone who has seen it to see it. Alex shook his head and chuckled. They seem to have a leak. Really? This surprised Vivian, especially after what she saw. Alex nodded. All it took was one video to get out, and then 10 copies were made and thousands were emailed and transferred and copies made of those and so on and so on. So, what's going to happen to them for what they did to me and Cooper? Alex sighed and looked up at her. I know what should happen and I know what will happen. Nothing. They will probably just get slaps on the rise. She was tired of this and wondered if she shouldn't tell Alex what really happened to Jake. She decided against it. Too many people were dead already. Vivian did cringe a bit with this question. Why only slaps on the wrist? She braced herself for the answer. Because they didn't ask permission. Alex breathed out. Vivian shook her head. So, all would have been well with the world if they had asked first. Alex nodded and knew it's not what she wanted to hear. She shook her head and sighed. Dear God. What else is on your mind? She looked over at him and decided to just spill it. Ever since this summer and all of the crap I've been followed, I'll come home and find things outside my house moved around, and one time I could smell a man's cologne in my truck. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm telling you, Alex, it's happened. Alex nodded and considered how he was going to handle it. I could put a detail on you so we can see. Vivian shook her head. No, but if I send you pictures of those following me, can you ID them? You can't run them? I've run a couple of them through the facial recognition software we have, but I have a feeling it's above my pay grade. Alex nodded in understanding. Send me what you have and I'll do what I can. Just to let you know, I've moved to Richmond Hill. You'll have to come by and drink a beer sometime. I'd like that. Alex smiled and the two visited for some time. Vivian texted him her new address and work phone number, and Alex had no intention of letting her get away this time. Who it is. T and everyone will move on. Alex watched her as she thought about what he revealed. Vivian woke up early and headed to Massachusetts. She later returned to find Nate, Lane and Mason standing in her carport. Mason, you could have gone in, I would have seen your cars and you know where I keep the key. Vivian scolded him as she walked to the door to let everyone in. I know, but it's your new digs, I didn't want to just walk in. The group filed in and looked around the house. It was a sprawling floor plan. The living room and kitchen were one large area divided by a counter that served as a breakfast bar, and the island counter gave the kitchen more counter space. It was an eat-in kitchen, and Vivian had an L-shaped bench seat installed in one corner with a small square table pushed up near it. A moderately sized dining room was on the other end of the kitchen through a butler's pantry. Off of the living room and the dining room was a long hallway that all but one of the bedrooms were off of. There was one small bedroom off of the kitchen, near the table with a 3/4 bath. And to get to the backyard you walk through a doorway to the mud room between the kitchen table and the kitchen. This is really nice, Viv. Lane looked around admiring her new house. Thanks, Lane. She looked over at him and smiled. I'm glad y'all came over today. I do have to say, Lane chuckled as he looked around, you unpacked pretty quickly. Yeah, Vivian looked around, I got tired of the boxes pretty fast. So, Mason walked over to her, you guys will be back at work tomorrow? Vivian laughed and shook her head. No, now I have to do some furniture shopping. Coop is going to help with that. True, Mason nodded and continued to look around, it's a bigger place. The group visited as Vivian started making some hamburgers to grill. Would you guys mind getting the grill started? Vivian looked to the group of men. Vivian held Mason back to talk to him as the others walked out the back door. Viv, before you say anything, I wanted to see how you're doing. Mason's look demanded a response. You're more important to me than anything to do with this job. Thanks, Maze, I'm doing all right. She turned away from him, afraid she was going to cry. I'm just trying to shake a lot of the feelings I've been going through since that crap over the summer. You're still going to Dr. Hardy? Mason was concerned now and knew why Vivian turned away. Yeah, and it's helping a lot. Vivian turned back to him knowing she had gathered herself. But I'm still dealing with a lot of it and I'm sorry if I'm coming off a little jaded. Mason shook his head and looked at her. You have nothing to be sorry about. I don't know many people who could come out of what you did and come back to work. It still bothers me that I might hurt one of y'all. Vivian looked anguished as she held a hand over her heart. I love you guys and I don't want to do that. Mason stepped over to her and hugged her. You have nothing to worry about, we'll always be here for you. Thanks, Maze. She stepped back and looked over at him. There's a reason I wanted to talk to you. She began to explain how she wanted to try to retrace the path Crimson Hellfire had taken her on. Mason nodded as she finished explaining what she wanted to do. That's not a bad idea, Viv. Vivian looked down at the floor. Mason, I need you in the car with me. Mason was surprised by her request to a point, especially since she and Cooper had been partners for so long, but he understood in another sense. Him and Vivian grew up like brother and sister. Of course, anything, Viv. I thought it might be the first step in finding out who did it. Vivian waited for him to say what he thought about the idea. Let's talk to everyone else. Mason watched Vivian, knowing that she was doing this to relieve some of the inner turmoil she was feeling. Maybe Sullivan will let us do that this week for a case. I had thought about suggesting that. Vivian looked over at Mason as she stepped toward the door, but I didn't want to be so presumptuous as to ask it. Let's go talk to the group and see what they think, Mason suggested, and they walked back to the kitchen area where everyone else was. Hey guys, Mason called everyone in. Viv wants to do something and she needs our help. Mason then began to explain what they planned to do and the group began brainstorming as to how to follow up on it. All of the men were excited to try out the suggestion but didn't anticipate any results. There are several ways that we could track your movements from another vehicle, Nate suggested as he considered the options the group had. We could track a cell phone, the GPS on the car, or put a tracking device on your truck. Well, Vivian started adding a twist to the mix. I'm going to rent an SUV so when we do this you guys are the only ones following us. And in addition, Vivian looked over at the men as she finished making the burger patties. It would take them much longer to track down a rental agreement than it would a license plate. Yes, Nate nodded in agreement, thinking it was a wise idea. Even the slightest delay would benefit us. Maybe we could rent a vehicle also. Lane thought it would be better that both vehicles were rented, knowing it would be easy to tell the two vehicles were together. Yeah, that might not be a bad idea. Nate offered his 2 cents. That way they wouldn't have our plate either. I still need to talk to Cooper about it, but I can't imagine he wouldn't want to be in on it. The group was able to settle on a plan and convinced Vivian to wait until they could join her. Nate said he would talk to Ben and he could go to work early and talk to Sullivan about that being their case for at least tomorrow. One of us in the alternate vehicle will have an open connection to you two in the primary. Lane looked over at the two, but we need someone in the car with you. We want one person to ride with us in the primary and one to drive. Vivian turned and washed her hands in the kitchen sink. She glanced over at Mason, who nodded. The four looked at each other trying to decide who would go with Viv and Coop, and who would ride in the secondary. I think Ben or Nate needs to be with them, Mason finally spoke up. And I'll be the ride-along. Why do you think that? Nate figured in part, it was because of their long connection to Lane's team. To run interference if necessary, Mason turned and sat at the kitchen table. Y'all are federal. Everyone nodded in agreement. The plan was coming together much better than Vivian anticipated. I'll go, Nate offered as he looked out at the crew. I'm former military too. That's a good idea, Lane nodded as he leaned against the kitchen counter. The plans were made and the crew settled in for a good meal.